Hi, I'm Ajit Lenin. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture video series part 19. We are looking at the six-layer framework for establishing enterprise architecture practices. And last week, we completed the architecture domains layer. So in the previous weeks, we looked at how from the top, the usage layer, we looked at how to identify the stakeholders, what viewpoints they are looking for, etc. And then when we got into the evolution layer, where we looked at the time dependency of the enterprise architecture itself. So how to define roadmaps, etc. So what are the time dependencies that's going to come in the breadth and depth, we saw how do we break it down at a breadth, and then how do we define the details at a depth, right? So we can define the breadth and the depth levels, what we want to get into. And then we got into the architecture domains where we looked at the business architecture, information, application, and technology architecture spaces, right? Each domain, what all components are available for the enterprise to choose from to create the enterprise architecture, right? So by this time, we have good knowledge, or we have made the decisions on what components do we need to capture in the enterprise architecture, at what depth level, and what viewpoints we want to carry for which stakeholders. So all this has been done in the previous layers, right? Now, when we get into the artifacts layer, we'll look at how do we use that decisions we made in the previous layers to define the artifacts what we need, right? So the purpose of the artifacts layer is to identify the artifacts to represent the architecture components we identified so far, right? And also establish the common notations, what notations we want to use, right? It could be preferably industry standards, or it could be custom built for the by the organization, and map those artifacts into the respective architecture components, right? And specify with which depth level what artifact to be used, etc. Right? So let's look at what are the types of artifacts we can use, right? I would broadly define the artifacts into four different categories or type of artifacts. So first is the catalog, then matrix, model, and flow. So we'll look at each one of them in a little bit of detail, right? So let's start with catalog. So catalog, as the name suggests, it's a list of a catalog, which is a list of architecture components. It could be any component. And also, while we manage the list, it also carries the definition of the component, right? Each component definitely should have an unique identity, and each component also can have categorization. So it could be one level categorization or multiple level of categorization based on the organization need, right? And organization can define for each artifact what are the mandatory attributes we want to carry across all the components, and also based on each component type, we can define what mandatory or optional attributes that particular component type needs to carry in the catalog, right? And catalog can be used across any domain. So it can be used for business architecture, application architecture, information architecture, technology architecture. So it could be used for anything. So on the right, I just listed out a simple example of application catalog, that we just have application which has an ID, name, and a category of it, whether it's a front-end application or a services layer as an, or it could be a service systems of record. So based on the categorization on what that application, where that application belongs to, and then a description field can define the custodian, and also can have some additional attributes like number of users could be an additional attributes we may want to carry, etc. for that application, right? So this is a typical, this is a simple example of catalog, right? Moving to matrix, right? So matrix, we are basically it could be a two-dimensional or three-dimensional mapping of architecture components. I mean, basically different types of architecture components could be two or more, right? It could be simple matrix, which just two types of components, or it could be a multi-dimensional matrix. The primary purpose of matrix is matrix provides us the traceability across different types of components. So across domains, across layers, right? From one depth layer to another depth layer, it can actually give us the traceability. And so I have listed out some of the examples, like we saw how we want to start from the business function in the business architecture map to a business capability, and that business capability gets mapped to an IT capability in the information architecture side. And then when we go into the application architecture side, how that IT capability maps to application. So all this can be represented in a matrix, so which gives us the entire traceability. Similarly, application to the technology stack, which we saw a couple of weeks back, right? So that can be captured as a matrix. Non-functional building block to the technology size, business object to an application mapping, stakeholder to a viewpoint, viewpoint to an artifact or portfolio, mapping about applications to the portfolio. All these are places where we can use matrices in the enterprise architecture, right? Let's move on to the model, right? So model, in my view, is basically defines the or represents the static structure or behavior or the relationship between the architecture components. So it could be any component, right? Model can be used across any domains, like can be so for some examples I've listed out as process model, right? Application reference model, application component architecture, technology architecture, deployment architecture. All these are components we saw in the previous weeks, right? All these are represents relationships or static structure or behavioral aspects of architecture components, which can be represented in a model, right? And the specific artifact to be used is based on the needs of organization. So I listed up some of the possible choices we can do. Okay, it's just illustrative, so we can use any kind of artifact. So business entity model can be an ER diagram or a class diagram. Business object model can be represented as a class or object diagram. The process model can be a class diagram or an Archimate diagram, Archimate component diagram, right? So when I say business process model, it is not the process flow as such. It is the static structure of the process, right? How it inherits, etc. Right? Application functional architecture can be an Archimate component diagram. Application reference model can be an Archimate component diagram, right? The technology deploy, this all could be component diagrams, right? So model is pretty much the static structure or a behavior, represents the behavioral components or the relationship between components. Now, when we go into flow, right? So flow is the dynamic aspect of it, how the information flows or the control flows across components. So again, flows can be across architecture domain, can be in the business architecture, information architecture, application architecture, or deployment architecture. So simple examples are process flows, experience service or interaction flow, how a customer interacts with an front-end system, which is an experience service, a system in information flow, a customer journey as such, right? So all those are can be represented in a flow, right? And again, we can choose specific artifact based on the need of the organization. Since I listed up some of the common flow artifacts, like you can have a process flow diagram, activity diagram, interaction diagram, sequence diagram, flow charts, or a simple screen flow, right? All these can be used for the flow based on the need of the organization. Now that we have seen all four type of artifacts, let's look at some of the common notations we can use, right? So I mean, organization can choose anything that's available in the market, which is industry standard, or we can use something customized for the organization needs, right? The key thing to be taken into account is whenever we choose a notation, so the notation should be easily understandable for the stakeholders who are going to consume it, as well as the learning curve should be simple for the participants who are going to contribute. So it should basically fit in to be comfortable for both the contributors and the consumers of the enterprise architecture, right? As long as that fits in, the organization can choose whatever notations they want to use, right? So some of the common things we use are Archimate, right? Open Group Archimate, UML, which is pretty common, right? BPMN is for the process flows, right? CJML is for the specifically for customer journey. Shen and Backman could be for the data modeling, right? So organization can choose any of these notations and map it to the respective artifacts, right? So now let's look at the artifact map, right? So the end goal of the artifact layer is to create an artifact map or a matrix that maps what type of component at which for which domain and what type of at what depth level, right? And for that combination, what artifact are we using, right? So and then what notation are we using for that artifact, right? So for example, so I listed some of them, right? So if we take a business process catalog, which is a very high level depth, I put it as depth level, named it as L1. So when at very high level, so it is basically a list of processes, right? So that can be a catalog. When it came to a next detail level, right, L2, business can be a business process model, which could be represented through a process flow for which we can use BPMN, right? And also entity model is also an L2 could be an L2 component that we can use class diagram. Similarly, business object model also can use class diagram, both using UML. when it comes to application functional architecture at a very high level, right? When we want to show the overall flow within a application landscape, we can use the maybe component diagram is one example, one of the artifacts we can use from Archimate, right? And then the same application function architecture, when we get into the next level, when you get into the next depth level, I've just put it as L3, right? When we can use an interaction diagram, how each of these applications going to interact with each other, right? What information is going to flow down, right? So again, that can be UML. An IT service flow is basically shows the orchestration within a service, can be a sequence diagram, right? Based on depth. So it can be a high level, we can use an activity diagram, or when we get into lower level, we can use the sequence diagram. So it could be any thing, or which basically whatever also the organization finds it comfortable based on what components we have chosen and to be part of the enterprise architecture, what are the viewpoints that stakeholders are looking for, and also the general comfort level of the stakeholders who are going to consume, as well as the producers who are going to create artifacts, right? Based on that, we can make a decisions, right? So summarizing, we looked at what artifacts layer is supposed to do, what types of artifacts, catalog matrices, models, flows, and also we looked at what notations, what are the common notations we can use, and also finally looked at the artifact map. Next week, we'll look at the repository layer, which is basically the physical layer where all these things comes along, and then what is the actual tool or platform which we're going to use to hold the enterprise architecture. Thank you.